What you're about to hear is from my introduction to Emmanuel Levinas's Totality and Infinity course. These lectures were done to be accessible to people who have not done the reading. If you are interested in diving in deeper, doing the reading, or want access to the deep dives into my notes and the questions concerning translation, then you will want to become a subscriber to my ongoing research seminar. I save all of that extra content for people who really want to dive in deeper. This lecture is meant to be a lot more accessible. Subscribers to the seminar get lectures I do with my wife Anne, but they also get access to my deep dives into Das Kapital, Being in Time, and Totality and Infinity, as well as a bunch of other works related to critical media theory, critique of political economy, and the foundations of time energy theory. You can learn more about becoming a subscriber in the description down below. And part 2 of Totality and Infinity course is going to kick off in October 2025. With that, I hope you enjoy this lecture. All right, everybody, welcome to day 4, lecture 4 of Totality and Infinity. Welcome in here. Great to see you, Will, Christopher, Mandy, as well as everyone else who's virtually present who has reasons for not being here, many of which were shared with me personally. Not that obviously that's required. It's not required that you tell me. But in Anne's case, she is preparing for her lecture tomorrow for the seminar. And this is like her only day that she can possibly prepare. And she works today. So she's working. And work is going to be one of the themes of today, actually. So I want to start touching base really quick with everybody and give you all a moment in breakout rooms just to talk in groups of, well, actually, we might not even have, I don't think, hold on. I'm just going to go ahead and pause this. Okay. So I guess I just want to ask you guys if anybody else has been really feeling impacted by anything in particular from this text. And so I'm going to go ahead and share screen so some of you can share your faces if you want to. Yeah, anything any one of you would like to put forward as something that this has been making you think about, or some kind of experience that reading Totality Infinity has enriched, or anything that has been brought up in any of the previous lectures that you've been thinking about?
So I have one thing, which is kind of I was reading through Totality and Infinity, and there was this kind of thing about the time and the other and the same in the other. And this was one of the things that kept coming back to time energy and things like that, about the fact of having patience for the other. Like if we have time for the other, then we can kind of let them in a way. And this was kind of like brought in by this last kind of chapter I was reading about how we actually bring the same, or sorry, how we actually bring the other into the same in a way. And so it was just kind of like, I felt like as I've been reading, this kind of notion of time has slowly kind of started to kind of creep in for me. And that has just sent a load of things connecting to how that connects to like time energy and things like that. So I feel like patience is kind of a key thing that I've kind of found.
Awesome. Thanks, Will.
Yeah, maybe to piggyback off of Will's use of the word patience. Um, this is something I think about a lot in terms of like a secular world setting where the idea of forgiveness, it doesn't always make sense to us, or there doesn't seem to be an imperative for there to always be forgiveness if you don't feel like you're even part of um, something connected, which maybe in the past would be like the specific religions of Christendom, Islam countries, uh, etc. This idea of forgiveness, because you are responsible to your others. Whereas we don't really have that responsibility to our others in a secular context. We can choose to decide who we want to associate with for the most part. Yet, then it's interesting then that Levinas is saying that we're always kind of beholden to the other. And what does that mean in in like a current context? Um, so just I don't know even if Levinas has gone to talking about what those different things are, like forgiveness could mean in this. Maybe that gets into like the second half of the book a little bit more, but just kind of just how he's like confronting us to think of these things like patience and forgiveness, um, but in his way that he's presenting it outside of for him Judaism, you know.
Hmm. It's good. I thought I had your guys' faces up on the screen this whole time. I apologize. I didn't. But now you are on the screen, so everyone can wave. Hello. Okay. Back to it then. So, Christopher, did you have something before we?
Yeah, I mean, you don't need our face on the screen because my face is more than just my actual face, obviously. So you did that on purpose. But for
Exactly.
me, I just like that he's taking a tradition I love, which is like phenomenology and like existentialism. And he's like, wait a second, you guys forgot like the most basic thing, which is like there's other human beings out here and we should all get along, and here's kind of why. But he's not doing it in like which I like an Alan Watts or like somebody like that who's just like, oh no, we're all one, and you know, the light in the other person's eye could be the twinkle that brought you here, and like all that stuff. And Levinas is showcasing it in this like elliptical argument, which I love, even though it's difficult at times, because he's just pointing to experiences we've all had. And he's kind of saying, if you refer to, like, if any of this resonates with you, you'll kind of get what I'm saying. And I think that's beautiful that it takes work, because if you're working through it, you get that gratification, and it's better than just reading like I don't mind hippy dippy stuff. And like, I went to a very like hipster college where it was like that back in the day, but it's like Levinas is doing that without like the whole like flower child thing, and he's doing it in a rigorous philosophical way. And it's just like, be patient, be a better person, realize you can't just reduce somebody to a bunch of like president hand attributes, and just realize like, hey, doesn't any philosophy matter if it doesn't come to ethics and like giving a shit about each other? Because we're gonna have war. We just had one. We could have another one. Like, let's pause a minute, figure out what the fuck's going on, and then see if we can fix course. So I just think that's wonderful. And then I like the enjoyment stuff a lot, because it's like, okay, you're saying a bunch of stuff about Dasein and whatnot, but it's like you also enjoy the taste of the actual coffee cup you're using. So the Stanley mug girl in me like that.
Yeah. Yeah, the enjoyment of the cup, the enjoyment of the lighter, the enjoyment not of just the food, but of its texture, of whether it's hot or cold or cool or hot, right? Like I love all of that, and it got me thinking. And what it inspired me to do was to take a fast. So last week I gave that lecture. I talked about the elemental. For people who are binging this course right now in the future, and they just listened to that lecture and now they're instantly listening to this lecture, you're kind of proving what he says about representation and about how it happens in a void of time. Representation right? Videos are representing something, right? But it's making present, it's present at hand, right? It's taking everything out of its context in a sort of sense. So then in my saying, in my voice here, I want to say what happened, what has transpired since that last lecture and this one is that I fasted for 86 hours. Okay. So I've never fasted that long in my life. I've fasted I think I've fasted for 3 days before, but I pushed it as long as I could. And then I was feeling really weak I think it was Wednesday. Yeah, I was feeling really weak and kind of like, whoa. And then I was like, I just really need to eat. And I was like, no, I can push it longer. And so I went and laid in my bed and I was like, I'm just going to take a nap. And then when I wake up, I'll get a second wind and then I could push this fast for another like 8 hours probably. And then Anne like comes in, she just came home and she's like, how are you doing? She's kind of like looking at me like, how you doing? And I was like, yeah, I'm just going to take a little nap. And she's like, so you haven't eaten yet? And I was like, no, I'm going to push it longer. And she's like, really? She's like, and that's fine, huh? And I was like, well, I mean, I think so. And I was like, okay, Google, how long can you go for a fast without any food and while still being healthy? And then, it starts responding by voice and we're both listening to it saying that, 12 to 24 hours is safe for everybody. But generally speaking, you can go for, 2 to 3 days without really any problems. But anything longer than that, you're going to need, you're going to want to do it under the supervision of a physician. And I was officially past the limit that it had said. And Anne's like looking at me the whole time. And I was like finding myself accountable, to the other. And so I was like, shit. Okay. So I got up and I went downstairs and I ate some blackberries and they were the most delicious things I've ever had. But I made a ritual of it. I went and I showered first and then I set up the blackberries that we had picked off of the vine from a few blocks away a couple of days previously, set them up on a plate. On this other little plate, I put some salt and some nutritional yeast and I just ate the salt like with my finger and I ate the blackberries and it was just like I was in heaven. It was like the best meal ever. All of that to say, this was inspired directly by Levinas, right? Levinas is the one who got me thinking about how we are dependent on the elemental. But in that dependency, we find a kind of independence, an independence in enjoyment, an independence in atheism that creates separation. The ability to kind of just be willfully blind of everything else and just in the moment. It's definitely how I felt when I was eating those blackberries, right? But it's in that independence through enjoyment that we can then also discover the ability to prolong or delay or postpone this distance between the need and its satisfaction. So if you're just living in the state of nature and directly participating in the elemental, there is some kind of enjoyment to be gained, but it's not the kind of enjoyment that becomes the condition of solitude and atheism and separation that we discover in more complex civilizations, right? Especially ones that develop, complex language and stuff like that. That whole note on participation is one that I've been wrestling with and thinking about a lot. I know that there's a very easy way to just dismiss it and say, well, that's old anthropology. It's just considered racism. Now let's move on. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. Looking into it, it's like, well, okay, yeah. So I think the biggest thing that the anthropologists were bringing in terms of their own presuppositions, their biases when looking at primitive people was the idea that they themselves were not still in a state of participation. just because you have seemingly more separation, more enjoyment, and also more ability to postpone satisfaction of needs and sort of delay enjoyment, and in doing so create a world, like, which is going to be part of Levinas's argument. Just because you have the ability to do that more than a so-called primitive doesn't mean that you yourself are not still participating. Does not mean that you yourself are not mythological, right? We think that we live in a post-mythological world. We think we live in a post-religious world. We think, like Weber, that the world is disenchanted, right? All of this makes me really want to read Bruno Latour's book, We Were Never Modern. I haven't read it, but I understand. I'm pretty sure that it's arguing we thought that we were disenchanted, but in reality, our life is still fully enchanted. Older Bruno Latour, of course, will walk that back, right? He thinks we've underestimated the degree to which science really has changed the game, and there is something to modernity. So I don't know. I'm confused about Latour and really where he's at. And for anyone who doesn't know, he's just like probably the most cited anthropologist and sociologist alive, or at least the one in France who's alive. And he belongs to that generation of post 68 radical social theorists in Paris. That's all an aside on participation and future research questions for me. This question of, to what degree might we still be participating without realizing it? How much might we think we are separate when we're not really? These are all big questions, but just bracketing that for the time being and writing with Levinas, and actually let's just be 100% sympathetic, and I'm going to be for the rest of this lecture. I'm just going to take up his position to the best of my ability. We do not live in direct contact with the elemental. If we did, my life would be immersed in games with the people I live elbow to elbow with. We wouldn't have secrets for the most part. We'd be running through the woods, hunting and gathering berries and celebrating, dancing around the fire, sharing in songs and stories and myths that all blend religion and philosophy and science, and it would be beautiful and fun, okay? It would also be terrible. And this mixture of fun, terror would make it so that we do not have this kind of solitude that is the condition of the kinds of recollection and representation that we now take for granted in the 21st century. We being people who read. Because the kind of recollection and the kind of representation that we, those few remaining people who read, take for granted is not something shared by most people. And so to the degree, how to say this? It's almost like we, and I'll speak for myself, I was fully immersed. I was in full participation. Yet I took myself to be modern. And it has been through the process of coming into the life of the mind and texts and recollection and representation. It's through that process that I've kind of discovered a whole new life. Most people, though, aren't doing that, right? They don't have the time energy for that. They don't even know that it's a possibility, right? Most people, it's work, Netflix, hopefully with other people, lucky if even. Rinse and repeat. Maybe you throw church into the mix. Maybe throw the bar into the mix. But even then, your life is just this sort of blend of sort of science, we should say the veneer of science smeared over what's really just myth and rumor and superstition and religion, right? The Enlightenment ideal laid out by, well, it's not just laid out by Kant, but really summed up by Immanuel Kant in his What is Enlightenment piece that he published in a newspaper once upon a time. And you can read, it's very short, it's very good, and you should definitely read it. TU is building a studio. I have officially cleared ground. I've been working on it for the last several months on and off, but am, as of this last week, beginning to get a lot more traction on the project because more money has come in. So thank you so much for those who have already contributed via donations for the TU studio. It's going to happen no matter what, but the question is when. If you want to help speed up the process, make things smoother sailing, and help me keep creating the kinds of content that you love, and even better, the kinds of content that is to come. There's a whole new era getting rolled out. If you want to help make it possible and usher it in smoother and faster, the best way to do that is to make a donation via the Zelle link up on the screen here. You see that QR code? Use that QR code. Once you have an account, that QR code should take you to where you can make the bank transfer with zero charge, which is really sweet, huh? Yeah, we love that. That's why we're using Zelle. Thank you so much for helping make this possible. The Enlightenment ideal he spells out as, humans freeing themselves from bondage of authority and of taking things for granted and of taking responsibility for their own immaturity, for their own knowledge. That was supposed to be something brought to the wider world. It was supposed to be something that could be disseminated across masses. It was supposed to be something that could be brought to us through the public education system. It was supposed to be something that would raise literacy rates, but not just literacy, but the ability to interpret texts and enter into interpretive communities so that we could have civically engaged people, really like the founding fathers are made out to be. The way that they are made out to be is this image, this ideal of the Enlightenment subject. They read everything. They were polymaths. They were enthusiastic about all of the arts and sciences, and they plumbed the historical archives for every example they could find on how to construct a government. And then they took the best and they left the worst, and they tried to combine some kind of a system that could do something different, right? And it's like we're kind of in a situation today where we actually need that more than ever, but the conditions of possibility are absent. And that's because people think that they're literate and they think that they're modern, but they're living in participation. Like primitives, except that they have smartphones, and so that they think, well, I'm not a primitive, haha, right? So I think it's almost too convenient to just dismiss that all as racism or outdated anthropology, because it lets us off the hook and helps us forget that we are ourselves already always in this sort of immersed blending participation of everything that doesn't allow us the kind of atheism, separation, or solitude that Levinas is talking about. Well, at least it does in a sort of sense. So you might be kind of primitive in a sort of sense, but you're also not in another sense, right? So you are the cybernetic primitive, right? Taking it back to critical media theory. Taking it back to McLuhan and the idea of the global village, he was already thinking about how we were becoming post-literate, right? Yeah, but you're not part of the global village. You're part of a niche online consumer demographic, right? So what does that mean? What does that do to us? I don't know. But all I want to say is that to dismiss the idea of participation as some sort of self-congratulatory first world imperial anthropology misses the complexity of our situation, where it's like we are re-entering, if we had ever left, this kind of participation, except that it has new pros and cons compared to the kind of participation that other people historically for millions of years got to engage in. And some of the pros and cons should be pretty obvious, but I would say the biggest con is that if we all got together, there's no dance that we all just know that we could all get into, you know, stomping our feet and like having a good time. There's nothing we could do. There's like, we could dab together. That's about it. Oh, we all know how to dab. Hooray. That's so fun. Yeah, stupid. I'm sorry. We don't have amazing dances. We don't have amazing stories that we all share. I just asked my class, Sociology 101, which started this week. Don't ever start a class during the week that you're fasting. It went well. It went well, I think, but it was crazy. But I asked them, I was like, how many of you seen Game of Thrones? One person. And I was like, okay, well, this is why we're going to talk about the post-class fractured mass in this class. You know? And they're all like, they instantly vibed with it. Like, they instantly get the idea of being a part of the fractured mass. It's amazing how intuitive this concept is. Primitive peoples do not have this experience of being a part of the post-class fractured mass. Doing alien anthropology as a big theme at Theory Underground is going to mean, in part, thinking a lot about what it is to be a part of the post-class fractured mass, surrounded by people in a state of participation without contact, in a state of separation without solitude. Right? All right. So this is, for me, like something I've been thinking about every day, right? But I've also just been thinking about sensation. Everything, like, I think I'm more attuned to the things that I'm touching, to the things that I come in contact with, to the things that I desire. And it wasn't just the fast. Every time I felt an urge, whether, even if it's just something innocent, like I'm going to grab a drink of water, every urge, as I go for it, I just go, no, I'll put it off just a little bit. And you know, some people would say, well, you should do that with everything except for water. People do not drink enough water. And I'd say, absolutely, except I drink more water than most people. Like, I've been in a pretty good habit of over a gallon a day for at least 15 years, so I'm fine. I'll be okay. But like, so I go for water and then I stop myself and then I'm like, no, I'm going to do something else. And I've been doing this as a flex to just kind of reassert myself into a situation where I'm just thinking about how correct it is when Levinas is talking about our ability to postpone, our ability to delay. When I pull out the food in the morning and the cats are just so excited. They're like, this is the best moment of my day. I've been hungry. These freaking humans, they sleep way too long. Now they're finally up. Let's go. Let's go. There would never, ever be some occasion where they go up to the food and then they go, actually, even though I'm like starving right now, I'm just going to just chill for a little bit, just to flex on the bod, just to kind of like, who's the bitch now, motherfucker? You know, now cats won't do that. I don't know that there are in nature or even in any domesticated animals, except for the human, examples of that kind of bodily renunciation, the ascetic, right? The idea that the ascetic puts us in touch with the spiritual is very interesting. You know, one of the people who works at the sociology department found out I was fasting, and she starts telling me all about how, you know, it's not just the physical. Everyone talks about the physical benefits today, but there's these spiritual benefits. And she's talking about how it puts you in touch with the invisible. And I was just like, you know, I mean, she's super woo-woo-y,
but she was sounding a lot like Levinas in that moment. And so I started I was talking about Levinas and telling her about that. I was like, yeah, Levinas says that. I'm teaching this book right now. He talks about that. And she's like, oh yeah, I don't really read. She's like, there's another dimension that you can kind of get in touch with, you know? And I'm like, yeah, 100%. I'm in touch with it right now. And it's true because a lot of the time it's like, there's like this train coming. It's like the train of mealtime. And if you actually have just kind of flipped the switch in your brain and you step back and you just let it pass you, it's weird because you let it pass before it's even arrived, which is to say you stop anticipating it, which is to say you don't even realize once it's passed. There's this sort of turning your back away from the tracks and the oncoming train and walking away, and you just put on some soundproof headphones and get into a completely different world. And now you have no reference to that train for a while, at least. Okay. On a normal day, that train of mealtime is coming and you're trying to get things done. And then you feel aggravated or anxious or you've got it all together and everything's right on time. But the point is that you're going to cut off what you're doing. You're going to switch gears. You're going to sit down. You're going to focus on the meal. You might relocate to enjoy the meal. So like it's a ritual, right? And so saying goodbye to that ritual for a while frees up time in the craziest, most expansive way. I was actually able to get so much stuff done, including reading. So in a sort of sense, it helped me with teaching Sociology 101. You know, it's like having this class and preparing for the lecture tomorrow and doing sociology all at the same time seems like a lot. I also did all the organizing stuff with Žižek and the stuff that happened yesterday. Like, that seems like a lot, but I had twice as much time as everyone else that week. It's not just the half hour or hour of the meal. It's the anticipation of the meal, breaking the chain there completely. It's wild. And I think it's crazy that a book can impact us at this level, can basically reinterpret, but it can also give you some kind of like new basis upon which to act. Now, we actually have twice as long, not because we're fasting, we have twice as long to get through the last part of this reading as I thought. I was like, wow, I have to read 40 plus pages of Levinas this week while teaching sociology. That's insane. But then I was like, oh, actually, there's an extra Saturday in August. So there will be a final lecture. This is not the final lecture. This is like we're almost like, I feel like we have like this extra time, right? Thanks to the extra Saturday of this month. And so there will be a final lecture next week. So this week's reading on the syllabus is, let's see, it goes all the way to the end of part 2, which would be page 183. Okay, so reading all the way to page 183. But all you'll be reading this week is up to page 163. Finish part 4 of 2D. So you'll read through 2D4 and stop when you get to page 163. Go ahead and just make that note to yourself. I can send a reminder through email. But this is the week where you're going to face Emmanuel Levinas at his most seemingly conservative. This is where Luce Irigaray Judith Butler, and Simon Critchley all take up various stances of negation towards him, right? This is where they say, okay, grandpa, sit down. You were our master, but then you said the woman has a different dimension than the dimension of height. She's the horizontal one. What, she's supposed to lay on her back? Shut the fuck up, old man. And it's first of all, here, let me push this button for you all.
Trigger warning.
So Slavoj Žižek said trigger warning, and the joy that he feels in saying it, you can hear it in his voice.
Trigger warning.
That joy is something that I also share in the transgressive moment to come. I hate to break it to the people who take queer theory to be the last word on all things theoretical and human. But conservatives will never go away. There will always be conservatives because there will always be people who are trying to hold on to something. In fact, I would say that queer people and queer theory is itself trying to hold on to something called equality, egalitarianism, an emancipatory movement, the civil rights movement, politics as it used to be done, whatever. So everyone's holding on to something. Everyone's trying to keep something alive. And if there's going to be anything human in the future, it will probably have something to do with various forms of conservation. So, of course, I'm using conservative in a very strict sense here, which is to say, trying to hold on to something, right? Or say that maybe tradition has something figured out. Now, Levinas is actually going to, on one sentence in this week's reading, give away the fact that he's open to this being a little bit more flexible, a little bit more queerifiable than perhaps, some kind of recalcitrant conservative would be. And I think that's because most conservatives that we can think of do not belong to interpretive communities. I think that that's a big problem. I think that you can't really preserve anything if you don't know what you're preserving, and you can't know anything if you don't learn to interpret. And so the people who have the strongest impulse to preserve aren't able to even think what they're trying to preserve. And most of the things that they take up, or at least the ways that they take up those issues or causes, is something that was prefigured for them by some right-wing think tank that's funded by some billionaires who have nothing to do with regular human interests. But at the most basic level, the most perhaps triggering for some people, conservative idea is that there are men and there are women, and that these are distinct experiences. When I said at the beginning of this course that I think that this course is being written by a man, and he is a self-aware man, I think that really kind of proves out in section D of this week. Because he will bring in the feminine and the woman and use those two terms interchangeably. It's like the woman becomes a new character in this whole story, this whole phenomenology. And the role that she plays is one that is traditional in some sort of sense. Of course, we could do this thing where we go, well, across all cultures, across all societies, does it hold true? Is this some historically contingent idea? Blah, blah, blah. Honestly, maybe. Even in a matriarchy, I think that this would probably still be true. The idea is that in most cases, with few exceptions, in any sort of a developed society, women are still almost always, at some point in their lives, mothers. And that is something that they have to prepare for. And it's also something that makes it inconvenient to do certain kinds of things that men often do or usually do, right? And there's certain kinds of work that men usually do on the basis that there are certain kinds of average or general characteristics that men have that make them more readily available for certain kinds of tasks. I mean, this is elementary. I shouldn't have to really go into this and belabor this point. But he's not saying that women are baby farms. You know, I think that you could get that out of this if you really wrestled him into some contorted pretzel that would then, you know, do your bidding. You know, you can mouth his words to kind of say that, but I don't think that that would be fair to him. I think Luce Rigore, especially, makes sense. So does Simone de Beauvoir. They make sense as feminist critics of Levinas, which we're not really going to get into too much here. It's all very intuitive stuff at this point, but at some point, probably within the next year to 2 years, we'll have entire courses on Simone de Beauvoir and Luce Rigore, so don't worry about it for now, okay? But the feminine function for Levinas is not, for the time being, in this week's reading, it has nothing to do with the child. It has nothing to do with that. That is something that comes from the meeting of the sexes. We'll just put it that way. On average, most of the time, that is what comes. But the basic point of what we're getting at is that being at home with oneself and atheism and separation, all of which can be called dwelling. And, so he actually says that these are all synonyms. Pay attention. There's a sentence where he says these words are all synonyms. And he uses the word synonym, so you could just Control F the document to double check. But these words are all synonyms. Being at home with oneself, atheism, and separation. They're synonyms. They're synonyms of dwelling, of habitation, which is to say removal from the elemental. Right? The body, he says, the body is in between exteriority and interiority. It's at the limit of interiority and exteriority. He says that about the body. But also the same can be said of the dwelling. The dwelling is at the limit of the private and the public. He talks about how it faces the street, but it has its secrets. He talks about the window and being able to look through and have like a sort of dominating gaze, right? You can plan all of your next movements by looking out the window. It's like one of the best things you can do is to stand and look out a window while you're planning, right? Like there's something special about windows. But why do all CEOs exist in skyscrapers with giant glass? They want to stand and like look out over the world, right? They're planning, right? I want that. Fuck. I mean, come on. I want to be able to stand up high and walk around and think and be able to look far off in every direction. I want to be able to do that every day. I want a tower. Anyway, I think everybody wants a tower. Everyone should be allowed to have a tower, all right? In my future, everyone gets to have a tower. But this dwelling, this habitation, this being at home with oneself, this atheism, this separation, is the condition of recollection, of a special kind of remembering. It's the kind of remembering that is cultural, and it's the kind of culture that really has sort of put nature at a distance. So in participation, you still have some kind of memory, but you are immersed in the elemental, you don't have this kind of distance from it. The kind of recollection that gives us some kind of distance from nature, according to Levinas, is also a distance from instinct itself. It becomes the condition of our ability to flex over the body and to create a distance between need and satisfaction, to be able to extend that interval in time, to be able to delay or postpone the inevitable satisfaction. And that kind of recollection is the condition of Husserlian intentionality and all philosophical representation. But what does this have to do with the feminine? I'm getting there. So the dwelling / habitation / being at home with myself / atheism / separation is the condition of recollection, is the condition of representation, is the condition of our grasping labor possession. Okay. Our ability to go and say, you know what, I want a walking stick. I'm going to go cut it off of the tree, and then I'm going to skin the bark off of it, and then dry it in the sun, and then varnish it, and then let that dry, and then add another coat, and then put some ornaments on it, and then walk around with that walking stick. Well, that was a tree. It was just part of, it was an edge or a side of the elemental, and you broke it off, and then you made it a furnishing, as he'll say. It's a furnishing. It's a movable. It's a thing that you now possess. Through your labor, you now possess this thing. You've made it into a thing. It wasn't a thing before. Now it is a thing. He says that you've actually stripped it of its being. You've in making things possessions or property, he says that they lose their being. And they become a furnishing. They become a tool. They become a thing, right? And then that's the condition of possibility for them becoming commodities, which he'll kind of get at towards the end of this week's reading when he's talking about money and how money makes all these things exchangeable, right? He's kind of echoing something he had talked about a couple weeks ago. This grasping labor possession, well, you can do that in the state of participation, can't you? Right? Immersed in the elemental, you're in nature, you make necklaces and you make totems and you make, yeah, sure, absolutely. I think what he has in mind, though, is a much more calculated kind of labor, right? You're putting things off at more of a distance. There's more planning. And it's all done to give you more freedom from living hand to mouth. Right? Hand to mouth is when I first ate those blackberries this week, and then I was on my way to the school and I was going to do some lecture prep for the next day. I knew that there were some blackberry bushes at the back of a park on the way, and my promise to myself was that I would break the fast and then only eat blackberries for an entire day. It was just like something I was going to do. Completely arbitrary. And so playing by those rules, I like riding my bike, and I'm like, I'm aware that this park has blackberry bushes at the back of it, and I'm like, I bet that there's a bunch of blackberries back there. And so like I park the bike, and I go back, and it's like I had to go like off the paved trail and off into like I go through a couple of homeless encampments, and I mean they were unstaffed, like unpeopled. Like those people are living there, but they were away from their little camps. And so I'm like back there, and I find all these blackberries, and I just start eating, and I was completely in it. And the point is like this living hand to mouth kind of idea is like you get hungry and then you eat. I completely lost myself in the experience. It was like one of the most, I was going to say one of the most transcendent, but I stopped myself. Levinas will not say that that is transcendent. But it's analogous to transcendence, and everything going on in part 2 of the 3 parts of Totality and Infinity, everything going on in part 2 is analogous to transcendence. He says that at the bottom of page 1 of the beginning of part 2. Remember that. Everything going on here is just analogous to transcendence. All of this stuff about how the elemental seems infinite, seems transcendent. No, it's not. He's going to exhaust the analogy, and then he's going to bust apart the analogy. That's what he's trying to do in part 2 of Totality and Infinity. But it is a lot like transcendence, because it feels like you've the I, the ego, you feel like you've left it behind. You're just kind of in this berry picking, stuffing your face. It was awesome. I at one point I was like, I'm like stuck to all these thorns. I am like in these blackberry bushes because I was trying to get the ones that are a bit further back. Well, the kind of labor and possession that Levinas is talking about is the most opposite of that. Now, John Locke in his second treatise on government would say that I am laboring because I am exerting my human energy and force to act upon the world and change it. And in so doing, the berry being picked is mine by right of labor. I've picked it. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. It's the development of the beginning of the labor theory of value is right there in John Locke, second treatise on government. Because there was a time when where Will lives, not too long ago, it's actually really not that long ago at all, you didn't have right to the product of your labor. The things that you could get through your labor, like were properly speaking the king's. Everything was, right? And then there were like little exceptions that could be granted out by right of birth or title, right? Or, well, you're a blacksmith or you're a this, but that's the king's forest. That's the king's berries. You live on his graces, right? And John Locke was a heretic. What he was saying was treason. Absolutely. It was treasonous. And it's exciting. John Locke is very exciting to read when you think of him in his context. The kind of labor that Levinas is thinking about with this grasping is not just the possession in that moment that it comes off the vine and I'm holding it in my hand and then I consume it and I take that other into the same. That is not what we're talking about. The kind of possession here is the kind that stores those berries up. And now, of course, Native Americans did this. All kinds of people throughout human history have dried berries and then eaten them in the winter, right? But it's not just storing up berries. It's actually setting up a more complex society so that you don't have to do everything yourself. So there's some kind of a division of labor so that you can free up time and energy, so that you can actually expand the interval of time between need and satisfaction, so that you can diversify your life and actually participate in the liberal arts. You can do other kinds of things, right? So we're talking about that basic act of drying those berries multiplied to such an extent that there's a qualitative change. Okay. So how does the feminine come back into this? Okay. Dwelling / habitation, being at home with myself, atheism, separation, leads to is the condition for recollection, is the condition for representing, is the condition for grasping, is the condition for labor and possession. All these things we kind of just take for granted, and that philosophers have historically taken for granted. They tend to just focus on this aspect, the representing part, right? They think of everything as present at hand. PAH, baby. Well, I've labeled these 3 big steps, this dwelling, recollection, and representation, and then grasping, as B, C, and D. And then on the whiteboard, I have this A with a question mark, right? What comes before being at home with myself? What comes before atheism, separation, dwelling, and habitation? And the answer is the feminine. did anybody ever notice that the symbol for female or feminine, I don't know if it's supposed to be the symbol for one or the other or both, but the symbol, it's a circle with basically a plus sign underneath it attached. It looks like a stick person, right? How cute is that? Anyway. So the feminine is the condition of possibility for dwelling itself. Oh, what? Levinas, is that because you're saying that a woman has to clean and bake bread and stay home all day with bare feet just to make the place, okay, sort of, but also not quite. That sentence I told you about that says that this is a little queerifiable, okay, is that he says the dwelling is inherently feminine even if there's not a woman there. So the way that he's using the term, he says something about like responding to potential ridicule, and then he like makes that as a sort of stipulation. I think that he was aware even at the time of this writing that, you know, the day of reckoning is coming. I'm not going to be able to talk like this forever, so I better put this like clause in here. But that's a lot of me rolling over for girl bosses and not giving trad wives their due. That's a lot of me capitulating to Simone de Beauvoir and Judith Butler and not giving the moms of history their due. And I think that I can just sit here and go, okay, I've done my dues. I've said enough progressive things. I'm going to go full trad dad for a second and just say, guys, most women want to be moms. Most moms don't want to have to work full time. Most human beings don't want to be full time in the professions. And most people who've had children say that that was the most meaningful experience that they've ever had in their entire lives. And most women I've ever met who've had children wanted to be able to spend the majority of their time with those children. These are facts. The legal system is arguably built to keep men around because those kids need fucking dads. And when those kids don't have dads, they get fucked up. Okay? So this trad dad mode I'm going to go into right now is also going to say all of the stuff that Levinas is saying about how the dwelling is conditioned by the feminine. It's something that philosophers have historically taken for granted. I think it's even something Judith Butler, Simone de Beauvoir, and feminism in general has taken for granted, right? Now, it's not always taken for granted. You know, we'll talk a lot about the shadow work that happens in the home and the way that the economy presupposes it and the ways that that goes unrecognized or unrewarded or seen as inferior to those supposedly male professions, which are themselves dehumanizing, but raised up to some sort of like, oh, well, it's special because it pays kind of level. And of course, that's a problem unique to capitalism. Capitalism is especially recent, though. And so when we're thinking about humans throughout history, and especially at this most elemental sort of phase that Levinas is thinking about, and when we're really giving the devil his due here, the point is this. The man, on average, goes out and does dangerous shit that takes a lot of courage and strength. When he comes back, he's very exhausted, okay? What Levinas is saying is that in order for that man to be at home with himself, in order for him to achieve this kind of atheism in enjoyment, in order for him to achieve separation, he actually needs to be welcomed home by someone who's been expecting him, by someone who cares about him, and by someone who's not going to just sit there and talk to him at the level of a teacher or a peer or I meant like more like a colleague, right? No, it's not office talk time. It's the time of this gentleness. It's a language without language, he says. There's a gentleness in the welcome of the dwelling. It's a gentleness in this welcome. And I think a lot of people are hurting today because they don't have that. I think a lot of people, not just incels, not just men going their own way, not just the manosphere, those are places where people who lack this, who are resentful because they lack this, all get together and then participate in discourses that basically curse them, that make it so that they will never be able to get the thing that they want, right? They're killing themselves. But a lot of people are suffering from this. Every child who's growing up neglected because both parents are working and their life is nothing but institutions and people who are paid to care about them. Every person experiencing that kind of neglect is feeling that something is lacking. And women are supposedly liberated today, but they're liberated to what? To work. Okay, well, last I checked, labor under capitalism is not liberation, right? It might be liberation from serfdom, if you were supposed to be a serf and you were supposed to stay in place forever. And there is a sort of analogy where it's like women are kind of considered the serf of the home, the serf of the mini feudal lord, the little patriarch, the laboring man who has his woman back at the house, right? But I also think if we were to just say, hey, humans are free, starting tomorrow, no one actually has to go to work anymore, things have magically changed. I think a lot of people would want to raise children and have them in their house and spend a lot of time with them, right? Creating love, sharing love. So there's that, and that's missing. And this is part of that humanness that Levinas is trying to conserve against the eroding, coercive, and desexifying forces of capital, right? Forces wants to desex us, or forces. The forces of capital want to desex us. In The Condition of the English Working Class, Engels talks about this a lot, right? Men are finding themselves at home trying to do the things that women historically do, and women are going into the factory with their children and doing the men's work because the men have been put out of work by machines that women can oversee. He talks about how emasculating that is. He talks about how it's creating children who grow like wild weeds. Children who grow like wild weeds. How many of you seen the movie Kids? I know Anne has. I know Nance has. Mikey has. Yeah, Kids is a good movie. It's a movie about kids growing up like wild weeds. It's what Engels is talking about. Now, Engels, ever the sort of historicist, constructivist that he is, progressive, historicist, constructivist, he doesn't think there's anything essential about the kinds of work that women have historically done. He takes that to be purely based on the material conditions of previously existing societies. His point is men feeling emasculated because they're doing women's work and women feeling desexed because they're doing men's work is a travesty because we all are in touch with like a situation where the family actually has certain kind of requirements, including a mother being around. And Engels talks about it in such a way that says, well, yeah, but in the future, different historical configurations of society or different historic moments where society is configured at the material level in a different way, different relations of production, those could make it so that women aren't needed for child rearing in quite the same ways, right? I think in Engels' mind, the child used to be raised by the village. Everybody shared those responsibilities. And that's ultimately where communism is going to get us to again. But for the time being, children need their fucking moms. capitalism is taking away their fucking moms, meaning that everybody feels like they're just roommates together. Nothing has changed about that situation. Not only did the predictions of Marxism not come true, most of them not come true, but that situation has only worsened. You're just not allowed to talk about it anymore. If you talk about it, you're supposed to say it's a good thing because women have been so liberated. I don't think that's progressive. I've been seeing a sort of meme recently, a lot of people saying, between trad, I'll actually go ahead and on the whiteboard here, put it up above, erase some of this stuff. Between trad wife and girl boss, is there a third option? Is there a third way out? People don't want to have to choose between girl boss or trad wife. Women who are so put out by the idea of being girl bosses, and they're so sick of feminism today, they go in this other direction. And for anybody who's been paying attention to the women who go in this other direction, there's a lot of dissatisfaction there as well. So you have like these influencers who are trad wives, but they're influencers, right? So they're not really trad wives because they are influencers. And then you have some of them discovering this is not the life, actually. I believe Laura Southern is an example of that. Is it Laura Southern? Lauren Southern? I don't know, whatever. The conservative woman. She went and tried to do that for a couple of years, burnt out on it. She didn't like how she was being treated by her husband. Well, yeah, you kind of come from a different historic set of conditions with different relations of production. So it's going to be a very isolating life, this trad wife thing. Also, the men who are like looking for a woman who wants to be in this sort of role, they're usually looking for a woman who wants to be submissive, which is to say, don't talk back and tell me all my ideas are good and give me everything I want. And so, yeah, that's even if a woman thinks that that's what she wants, in some cases she goes and she gets herself into that lifestyle and then she discovers that's not what I want. But she doesn't want to go the girl boss route. I think my mom wanted to be, well, I'm not going to say I think. I know she wanted to be a trad wife. My mom wanted to be a trad wife. She wanted to be the barefoot, sort of pioneer woman wife doing the homesteading thing. And she did a great job. I mean, every person I've ever met, especially women, every woman I've ever met thinks my mom is like the most iconic person alive. And she is. She's absolutely iconic. But she's not a trad wife, man. She's not a trad wife. She's more of a girl boss than any fucking trad wife you could possibly imagine. Like, yeah, she was a stay-at-home mom, but she ran like a business. First of all, from home, she was running a business while raising 10 kids. So she was running a business, she's raising 10 kids, she's homeschooling those kids, and she's running a farm. And she's doing all of those things at the same time. It was absolutely wild to grow up in that sort of an environment. She was definitely a trad boss. Maybe we'll call her that. She was a bit more of a patriarch, though. Like, my dad is more of like the simp. He's more of like he's not like some Giga Chad, like manly man who's like, yeah, this is my barefoot wife, chained to the stove. No, it was more like he comes home from working all day and then mom's like, you forgot to do this. You got to do that. You got to do this. And he's like, yes, honey, I'll get right to it. He would always say the from their Christian traditionalist interpretation of how things are supposed to be or whatever, he was under the impression that, yes, she is supposed to submit herself to her husband. But he was like, yes, but really what I run this like an executive, meaning I have veto power, but she's the manager. She gets to call the shots. So she's the manager. He's got veto power. If he ever wanted to use veto power on mom, it was like hell to pay and like pulling teeth for him, because in reality, she's used to running the show and she understands how everything works. And so if he wants to say, put his foot down and go, no, it's going to be this way, well, that's going to be potentially difficult, right? So she was not a submissive woman. Right? My mom was the least submissive woman I've ever met. So this distinction between trad wife and girl boss really does break down. But the reason that I elaborated on this so much is because I want to bring it back to when a woman tries to not become a PMC girl boss, when she says, you know what, I actually do want to have a child before I'm 38. Like, I actually might even want one in my mid-20s, right? You start getting all of this sort of, are you sure about that? Like, oh, are you sure? Like, oh, that's too bad. Oh, really? Are you going to be just a mom? All of a sudden, all of these women who've done nothing with their lives start clutching their pearls, acting like you're going to throw away your life. And it's like, oh, what did you do? You're an administrative assistant somewhere? Wow. So different. And so I bring up my mom because it's like, I want you all to know, like, my mom, she's not just conservative. She's also kind of just like, she talks shit and she's aggressive and she'll challenge people. But like, I get where she's coming from because I've been seeing the kind of reactions Anne gets just for saying that she wants children, for instance. If you get people like judging your choices that much for that long, especially when they're choices that are valid, like having children, for instance, yeah, you're going to feel a little resentful. People are screaming outside my window. I don't know what they're yelling about, but sounds like there could be a fight. This division between girl bosses and trad wives I take to be a division between the political left and the political right, and they're really simplistic ideal egos. They're really simplistic ideas of what a woman can be. And if you don't fit the mold for one of them very easily, if that cannot become, comfortably speaking, your habitus, then you might just gravitate towards the opposite. But even if you're not exactly going for the opposite, people are going to think that you are. And then once they start putting that on you and acting like if you were to choose that, then that would mean that you are this or that or inferior or duped, or it's just internalized misogyny or whatever. Then you get more resentful and then you start to identify with it in a sort of way. And it actually, you gravitate in that direction. We genuinely need a third option. And no amount of queerification and non-binary has yet developed a third option. Okay? 22-year-olds with shaved heads walking around in baggy pants saying that they're flipping off the male gaze and that they're lesbians. Like, it hasn't actually achieved anything yet. Nothing that we've seen except for more consumerism. There's not a real path forward, right? Queer people have always existed. They're always going to exist. They've been experimenting with other ways of doing things for a long time. But what about for people who want to reproduce the human race? What about for people who want to be families? Is there a real third option for them? Not right now. And everyone who decides to not participate in reproducing the human race, everyone who decides to kind of just go into their own little bubble and do their own little thing, or maybe choose their own family, make their own family, right, is still going to live off of the femininity that produced you in the first place. You're either living off of the benefits of having had a good mother, or you're living through the agony of the neglect that came from not having a good mother. Those are the only two choices. And usually it's some kind of a mixture, because usually we just got a little piece of our mother and the rest of us was just like neglected, right? And that's because our moms were working. My mom wanted to be a stay-at-home mom. Instead, she was literally running a business from home, telling herself she's a stay-at-home mother. No, mom, you're not. You just can't get out of the office is what you're talking about. Like the office is your home and you can't get out of it. And so you actually don't really get that time to spend with your kids, right? Under capitalism today, you don't get to be a trad wife or a girl boss. Like neither one is really an option. So we do need a third way. It'd be nice to have more than three, but you know, humans are simplistic creatures when we're talking about mass populations. The mass population at the level of its imaginary, symbolic kind of identities, having one other way of being would be pretty freaking cool. Men also need some other kind of idea to strive towards, right? But the creation of the symbols or the models or these other ways of being is actually something we're not going to get from artists until artists have lived long enough and experimented long enough and become theoretically informed enough so as to intervene in a way that actually matters. Until they actually have done the work, it's not going to happen. They could just sit there and like express their feelings, but genuine theoretical movements come from milieus. And genuine theoretical milieus have their own conditions of possibility. And real art movements come from those. You know, it's not the other way around. And so we always have some new avant-garde, like, you know, careerist attempt to say, oh, we're the new thing. And this is what it looks like. And this is our aesthetic. And yeah, until you actually provide the overwhelming mass majority of human beings alive with a new picture of a new way of being or some kind of a new idea or model for something that's not these two options, moms are going to constantly feel like they're torn between these things or being pushed or pulled in one direction on this silly binary. And people who opt out of being moms are the least capable of intervening or theoretically experimenting with some new way of being, right? They're the least able to because they're not going to have kids. And you know what parents hate more than anything else? Universally, left to right, parents hate people who are not parents telling them how to do what they have to do. Most universal thing ever. I wanted to spend so much time talking about fasting and blackberries and growing up and sort of living in relation to the elemental and possessing it and labor and dwelling and the condition of dwelling being in the feminine and doing all of my disclaimers and my
Trigger
little...
warning.
I wanted to do all of that just to sort of hopefully remove any barriers people will find when approaching the text this week. Because I feel like the way that Levinas has been read historically, which, you know, he's not been around that long. He's not even really been read historically. Not really. There's not several generations of scholarly research reading Levinas yet. But the way that he has been received, the way that he has been interpreted, doesn't take this stuff seriously enough. It's too concerned with not offending someone who's choosing to not be a mom. It's too concerned with not offending somebody who has no interest in having children. The interpretation of Levinas is not taking seriously this project of centering normies. That doesn't mean necessarily speaking to normies, but it means thinking about how human civilization could continue to exist in the future and keeping in mind that any kind of existing in the future is probably going to have men and women, and that most men and women are probably going to want children, and that will still be the most meaningful experience of their entire lives. It's not taking that seriously enough. But now that I've said all of that, bringing it back to time energy, because I really like how Will brought that up, and I've got some notes and I've got some stuff in the margins. The main thing I just want to point out is that the dwelling made possible by the feminine is where our energy is recouped. It gives us this power over time in the sense of being able to delay or postpone the satisfaction of needs, and also to sort of postpone when we have to labor again. And when we do labor, we can labor smarter, not harder, and therefore we conserve more of our energy and our time that we can then put towards other things. So there is this element of time that comes from the dwelling. That's not expressly developed throughout this section. It's kind of there, but you'd have to tease it out. The energy part is what's here. And I'm just going to read this quote from page 157. At the end of the first, the top there, it says, with a dwelling, the latent birth of the world is produced. Right? Because it's the condition of the kind of recollection and reflection that gives us the ability to master and dominate nature in the first place.
Oh, hey, Dave. What are you up to?
Hello. I'm grading right now, so.
Grading? Well, what's that?
Oh, this? This is a G2 pen. It might be the best pen in the entire world because the price point is perfect for working class people like us. More importantly, cartridges are replaceable. The ink, it glides, but it doesn't smudge too bad. And most importantly, you can do that. And it's really fun.
Whoa, that's pretty cool.
We at Theory Underground are not sponsored by Pilot, nor does Pilot endorse this commercial. Theory Underground is funded by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.
I know nowadays people like to read, these sort of rosy-eyed glasses accounts of how people used to live and say that people used to live with nature. But most places in the world, the situation was either living against nature, either you're being dominated by nature or you are dominating nature. Today, we have gotten so good at dominating nature that we're worried that we're going to get dominated again by something like climate change, right? But you don't just throw it out and say, "Oh yeah, we'll just go back to living in the elemental and having like this uncertainty about the future." This uncertainty about the future is actually one of the really big themes of the text that I've left out so far. I should just say something about it really quick before reading the rest of this quote. Basically, we love enjoyment so much, and enjoyment is so much more important than suffering, that uncertainty about the future presents itself. We take the uncertainty about the future seriously because of how much we enjoy existence. This is his whole argument. I kind of got into it the other day in the part one of going over the notes. But this is his argument against pessimism, against Schopenhauer, against Stoicism, against Buddhism. He doesn't say it's against Buddhism, Stoicism, Schopenhauer. He says the philosophers of existence, they focus on privation, they focus on indigence. He's basically saying they focus on the fact that life is suffering.
Okay, but what are the two most major philosophical traditions that argue that life is suffering? One is in the West, that's Stoicism. The other is in the East, it's Buddhism. Both say that life is at bottom suffering. Schopenhauer comes along, and his pessimism is 100% based out of that idea. Life is suffering. Why? Schopenhauer just says, well, take the joy of the lion as it sinks its teeth into the gazelle. Measure that joy from the lion against the pain of that gazelle. Which one overrides the other? No amount of joy on the part of the lion takes away the pain of the gazelle in that moment. That's supposed to be a proof. And when I read it, when I was younger, I was like, that's profound, right? It is on the basis of this kind of reasoning that life is ultimately always suffering, that Thomas Ligotti in The Conspiracy Against the Human Race argues that it's unethical to bring humans into existence at all. Antinatalism is based in the idea that life is suffering. It's kind of fitting that I spent the first 3/4 of this lecture building up to and then defending femininity in this more traditional sense, and also the idea of sort of like life, continuing life for its own sake, right? The love of life is what Levinas is going to use here to argue against pessimists. And he's going to say that suffering, that we say life is suffering, life is suffering, life is suffering, that suffering, as well as the awareness of indigence, of poverty, of fragility, of precarity, all of that is a response to the fact that life is enjoyment. All of that is a response to the fact that we love life. The person who wants to take their own life because they're so miserable is doing so against a standard of enjoyment, against a love of life. They realize that life is good, that life is awesome, but that theirs is shit. And it's because theirs is shit that they want to change the situation. They might not see a way to change that situation. And so they curse existence and they say, I'm going to take my own life. But that's a reaction against the fact that life is supposed to be better, right? Like life is suffering. This comes from a standpoint of remorse or like disappointment. Why? Because you do enjoy, because you have that capacity. And so he's using Heidegger's logic against Schopenhauer and all of the pessimists, the philosophical pessimists. And I've been talking to philosophical pessimists my entire philosophical life, right? Prior to finding a love for philosophy, I was a non-philosophical pessimist. And wanting to off myself was kind of a default setting. Like it was always like the way to get through a bad night, right? Nietzsche says that in one of his fragments. He says that the thought of suicide is the best way to get through a night. YouTube's probably going to make sure no one ever sees any Theory Underground videos again because I'm using that word instead of saying unaliving myself, right? It's so annoying when I hear people say that. I'm sorry there's a word for that. But suicidal ideation is a very common escapist fantasy, right? The fantasy is of the idea that you could take existence into your own hand and relieve yourself of suffering if you so desired. But Levinas says in this week's reading, it doesn't work. The tragedy of suicide is that the world doesn't end with you. It goes on existing. You don't win out against existence. It goes on without you. And in fact, he doesn't say this part, but you actually make others suffer more, right? There's a ripple effect. There's a ripple effect. Not every time you do not take full responsibility for your existence and you start sloughing off responsibilities and dropping the ball and letting things go and not showing up, it affects other people. Every time. This is part of the sort of curse of existence from a Sartrean standpoint, right? That not bearing the weight of existence means it's going to be difficult for others. Men are the best example of that because as absentee fathers, they ruin other people's lives, right? So they do escapism into drugs and alcohol and gambling and whoring or whatever they're doing. And what does it create? Misery for other people. Other children grow up like weeds. They don't have real families. They don't know how to handle their drive. They get themselves into tons of trouble. And then they basically have to teach themselves how to be adults. They have to reinvent the wheel, right? All because someone else didn't shoulder the burden of existence for themselves. Well, most of those fathers, most of those men, most of those man children were themselves products of broken homes, right? Like my dad had to rediscover how to be a man because his dad was a soldier who became like a commanding officer who was a veteran. And he was very, very successful in his time in the military. But the Korean War that he was in, as an extension of the fight against communism, it's all part of the European Civil War that happens between World Wars I and II. Really, it's the story of the 20th century is everybody's homes being broken by all of these fathers becoming, as Levinas describes on the first page of the preface, like unrecognizable to themselves due to the things that they had to do while in war. On page 21, he says, "The trial by force is the test of the real, but violence does not consist so much in injuring and annihilating persons as in interrupting their continuity, making them play roles in which they no longer recognize themselves, making them betray not only commitments, but their own substance, making them carry out actions that will destroy every possibility for action." Yeah, a lot of men don't have fathers themselves, right? It's pretty fucked up. And then people are like, well, we could just be post mom and dad. Well, yeah, good luck. I really look forward to seeing how these test tube babies are going to be. Let's bring it back to uncertainty. Uncertainty about the future disrupts our enjoyment. It puts a limitation on our enjoyment. But it's not the condition for a pessimist worldview. I mean, you can go there, but Levinas is going to say, you're not going far enough because you're not really thinking that all that pessimism is a reaction to an unfair set of conditions, an exploitative system, or your own unique idiosyncratic reasons for why you're not happy. But that is an exception to the general rule. The logic he's taking from Heidegger, remember I was saying that, I never finished that thought. The logic he's taking from Heidegger is to say that indigence and need and unhappiness, or there's a word that he uses, it's not decrepitude, it's something like that. I forget exactly what it is. You'll see it. The point is that these kinds of negative states are a deficient mode of enjoyment, right? In Being in Time, Heidegger uses that kind of reasoning multiple times, where he'll say, Dasein, being in the world, is always in a state of care, right? It's concernful being alongside the world. Someone might say, but I'm not concerned. I don't care. Those are not exactly the same word for him. They're not even synonymous, but they kind of do get at something. It has to do with projecting yourself onto a horizon of possibilities. That's what care has to do with. And concern has to do with focus, more like this intentional act on a specific thing. Well, he'll say, well, yeah, but Dasein unconcerned is in a deficient mode of being concerned. Dasein is the being that is concerned with its existence.
And when it's like, oh, I am not concerned, well, that's just a deficient mode, which is to say, like, all cars have an energy reserve. Oh, yeah, well, my car has no energy. Yep, that's just a deficient mode of your car's energy reserve, right? All cars have gasoline. My car doesn't have gasoline. Yep, that's just a deficient mode of a car that has gasoline, okay? The point is that the miserable, the negative, the pessimistic is a deficient mode of the love of life. Our friends who are in a pessimistic state of mind or week, month, or maybe it's actually just who they are. I don't know. Maybe you should always keep that on the table, that it might just be who they are. It could also be a phase, but it's one hell of a phase for some people, right? Is conditioned by their love of life. This uncertainty about the future that is such a big theme throughout this week's reading breaks in and interrupts our enjoyment and is the cause for our need to dwell, to create a dwelling, to create a habitat, and then to labor and then possess in a way that can store up and protect ourselves against the uncertainties of the future. Okay. But that kind of labor, that kind of strategy, that kind of theorizing that gives us a grasp over nature, that thematizes nature so that we can control it better to our advantage so as to have a less uncertain future. That requires the postponement of enjoyment. On page 157, we'll get into the quote now. Remember, I said, with the dwelling, the latent birth of the world is produced. This is why. Because of everything I just said. Now, he says, the postponement of enjoyment makes accessible a world. He says, being, lying, asciet, I don't even know what that means, but at the disposal of whoever will take possession of it. I think it's just like laying there, like, I don't know, but it makes the world lie at our disposal, is what he's trying to say. So that we can take possession of it, right? This critical distance from the world, created through dwelling, that gives us interiority, separation, atheism, gives us the ability to recollect and to be able to reflect and then to thematize, and then through that to be able to take possession of the world that now lies there before us. He says, there is here no causality. The world does not result from this postponement, decided in an abstract thought. The postponement of enjoyment has no other concrete signification than this putting at one's disposal, which accomplishes it, which is its energy. A new conjuncture in being, accomplished by the sojourn in a dwelling and not by an abstract thought. This whole like not by an abstract thought is just like his dig at philosophers, especially Husserl. He says, a new conjecture of being is necessary for the deployment of this energy. So we get a special kind of energy from the dwelling, and it's the condition of us being able to deploy that energy. He says, this sojourn in a dwelling, in habitation, before imposing itself as an empirical fact, conditions every empiricism and the very structure of the fact imposed on contemplation. Empiricism, John Locke, David Hume, like this general approach that puts the world up in front of itself as objects that can then be like grasped so fully that there are in those objects no longer any surprises, which is to say, you've stripped them of uncertainty. That kind of reflection is conditioned by this kind of response to uncertainty that breaks in on your enjoyment, that makes you then have to move into dwelling. And it's that dwelling that makes it so that you can have a certain kind of energy, that makes it so you can act on the world in this sort of way. That's all pre-theoretical. He's saying that all this stuff he's talking about here is the condition of possibility, not just for Husserl, but also for John Locke. He says, and conversely, presence at home with oneself exceeds the apparent simplicity the abstract analysis of the for itself finds in itself. Jumping down below, he says, the labor that draws the things from the elements in which I am steeped discovers durable substances, but forthwith suspends the independence of their durable being by acquiring them as movable goods, transportable, put in reserve, deposited in the home. Okay. There's a couple other wonderful quotes about energy. My big question for Terrence, who couldn't be here because he had some prior commitments, have to do with energy with a hyphen, which we find here on page 157, and energy without a hyphen, which we have on page 154. On 154, he says, interiority concretely accomplished by the home, the passage to act, the energy of recollection in the dwelling opens up new possibilities, which the possibility of recollection did not contain analytically, but which, being essential to its energy, are manifested only when it unfolds. It seems like we're talking about the same kind of energy. He's italicizing it both times that it is here on the page 154. It's also italicized one of the two times that it comes up on page 157, but in both cases on 157 it has the hyphen, and in neither case does it have a hyphen on 154. So I've got big questions about that. If we skip ahead to 159, energy reappears, once again italicized, this time also with the hyphen, where he says labor is the very energy of acquisition. It would be impossible in a being that had no dwelling. So, Levinas gives us the ability to say that the dwelling and the feminine, as the condition of the dwelling, are the conditions of possibility for time energy itself. That in a state of participation, without a dwelling, and without having someone who loves you, who expects you, who welcomes you back to your house whenever you're coming back from your day, you don't have this kind of energy. So my big question is this kind of energy different than some other kind of energy? Is there an energy that belongs to participation and it's different than the kind of energy that you have in the home? This is purely me now, but I'm going to go ahead and just say it. I think so. And I think it's the difference between the energy of erratic bursts of energy that is a restless kind of energy, and the cool, calm, and collected energy of Skole. I think that's what he's getting at. But even if he's not getting at it, I think we have to take it there. So why would that be true? Why would the woman be the condition of all that? Well, let's just go with the fact that we're speaking in generalities, and that it's okay to speak in generalities, okay? That you really can't talk about human existence without generalizing. And that when you're generalizing, you're not doing a universalism. Universalism would say it's true in all cases, whereas when you're generalizing, there are always going to be exceptions, and those exceptions prove the rule. And if someone wants to argue otherwise, the burden is always on them, right? Just the way it is. There's nothing you can do about it. So when we're generalizing, it's the woman who's welcoming the man back home. Okay. And in this sort of traditional schema, that feminine energy is one that calms, that soothes, that's gentle, that's caring, that's nourishing. And all of those are sort of adjectives that I think stem from the idea of nurture. That nurture is something that men do have the capacity to do, but that we find more commonly in women. Men are much easier to turn into instrumentalized tools that cut themselves off from their ability to nurture. So I have to make this distinction because it's such a big theme at Theory Underground. Everyone's gonna be like, really? Is it? I've never heard you talk about this before. Yeah, well, it's been in the works for a long, long time. Anne's gonna talk about it tomorrow at the seminar. There is a distinction between nurture. Everyone thinks I'm gonna say nature, right? No. There's a distinction between nurture and what's the word I want to use here? I almost want to say like control or domination. I'll just use domination for now. I'm forgetting the actual word that I want to draw upon. I'll have to double check the source. I get this from, you know what? I actually think it might just be oppressing there's nurturing and there's oppressing. I'll just put oppression. Is there really two P's in oppression? I don't know. Yeah. Yes. Cesar says yes. Nurture versus oppression. I think that's the distinction. No. Okay. Oppression is where we're going. I'm getting ahead of myself. So there's oppression and there's exploitation. The way that I'm going to use it, I'm getting this from Wendell Berry. He's a radical farmer. And he talks about how basically critical theory and social justice, he's writing in the 70s, has focused on oppression between groups. So there's oppression where we're talking about oppressors and the oppressed. A very essentializing, totalizing way of thinking about human beings. We say, oh yeah, well, you're an oppressor because you're a white person. Oh, you're an oppressor because you're an American. Oh, you're an oppressor because you're a man. Oh, well, she's a woman, so she's oppressed. So we should listen to her because, she's oppressed. And we're so tired of oppressors. Stop them. Stop the oppressors. Yeah, there's something to that, and it's a useful way of thinking about things sometimes. But what Wendell Berry wants to say in his amazing book, The Unsettling of America, I think that's the name of it. He says, instead of thinking about oppressors versus oppressed, where there's groups, right? You got group A, it's the oppressors. You got group B, it's the oppressed. He said, instead of thinking about this sort of black and white distinction between groups, we should be thinking about the distinction between nurture and exploitation that occurs not just between groups, but within every human. Nurture versus exploitation are the two most important tendencies or capacities of every human being. Every human being can nurture throughout the day and then also exploit throughout the day. Ours is a society that trains us to spend the overwhelming majority of our lives just exploiting, cutting ourselves off from nurture. And when someone gets an exception from this rule, it's usually a woman, and she usually gets to be exempted from exploitation insofar as she gets to be a mother. And that puts the human species or population back in touch with nurture, but then that gets essentialized as something that's for women. And what Wendell Berry is saying is that this war between nurture and exploitation runs through the hearts of every man and woman. But men are easiest to cut off from nurture altogether. Just exploitation. Just exploitation for men. And of course, second wave feminism was like, oh, but women can exploit too. Let women exploit too. Women don't have to nurture. And Wendell Berry's saying, that's not going to cut it, guys. Everyone should be put in touch with nurture. So bringing it back to Ivan Illich and tools for conviviality, institutions that are meant to be convivial for human beings would be drawing out our nurturant capacities, making us more nurturing. Not just of ourselves, not just of our animals, not just of our children, but also of the actual soil of the earth itself. Nurturing the earth. This is husbandry. This is stewardship, right? This is all Wendell Berry. So I'm bringing all of that into this, or am I? Is this already here, right? There's a lot of words that Levinas doesn't use. He also doesn't talk about most of the words that people use. Like you guys talking about bringing this into relation with how you think about some of the things you think about. You're using words people use nowadays that he doesn't use. That's because he sort of rewires us because of how careful he is to basically break from using words that we normally use. You know, notice there's no mention of empathy or compassion in this entire book. Right? There's just a lot of words that we use to try to get at things Levinas is talking about that he has refused to use. But nurture, I think, is one of those words that he's not using that is, it gets quilted a little different once we start thinking about it through a Levinasian lens. And I think that these people in academia who have traditionally read Levinas and appropriated him to their political projects often haven't spent much time thinking about nurture. So the problematic paragraph is on 155. He says, the simple living from ... right? That's the intentionality of enjoyment. The spontaneous agreeableness of the elements is not yet habitation, but habitation is not yet the transcendence of language. The other who welcomes in intimacy is not the you of the face that reveals itself in a dimension of height, but precisely the thou of familiarity. A language without teaching, a silent language, an understanding without words, an expression in secret. The I-thou in which Buber sees the category of interhuman relationship is the relation not with the interlocutor, but with feminine alterity. This alterity is situated on another plane than language, and nowise represents a truncated, stammering, still elementary language. On the contrary, the discretion of this presence includes all the possibilities of the transcendent relation with the other, that is an admission that the woman can also be the teacher, that the woman can also, she has all the possibilities of being the master and of engaging in discourse and language at that level. That's why he says all the possibilities of the transcendent relation with the other. Okay, but there's something else here. He says it is comprehensible and exercises its function of interiorization only on the ground of the full human personality, which, however, in the woman can be reserved so as to open up the dimension of interiority. And this is a new and irreducible possibility, a delightful lapse in being, and the source of gentleness in itself. Familiarity is an accomplishment, an energy of separation. With it, separation is constituted as dwelling and inhabitation. To exist, henceforth, means to dwell. To dwell is not the simple fact of the anonymous reality of a being cast into existence as a stone one casts behind oneself. It is a recollection, a coming to oneself, a retreat home with oneself in a land of refuge, which answers to a hospitality, an expectancy, a human welcome. In human welcome, the language that keeps silence remains an essential possibility. Those silent comings and goings of the feminine being, whose footsteps reverberate the secret depths of being, are not the turbid mystery of the animal and feline presence, whose strange ambiguity Baudelaire likes to evoke. I like how he brings in the feline presence, right? Because people who don't really understand femininity but have some cheap caricature of it very well alive in their minds, mostly because of Hollywood, I think, always just assume that every cat is a woman or a female. They really do. I've almost always had male cat. Every cat I've had so far was a male cat. And half the people who meet go, "What's his name?" And it's always just like, they always say, "What's her name? What's her name?" "Oh, what's she, her, she this, she that." And I'm always like, nothing about any of my cats has ever looked feminine. Like, all of my cats are always like these like clearly male cats. But to a certain kind of simplistic conception of gender, like, because the cat had the something about the feline, its movements, its grace, its agility makes people just go, "Oh, girl," right? And he's saying it's not like, this is not what we're talking about when we're talking about the feminine. It's not just that, right? The problem people are going to take with this, obviously, is like, he's saying that this feminine dimension is horizontal instead of vertical. He's saying that it's silent, that it doesn't even need language. Yeah, well, in the most absolutely simplistic terms, humans could exist without language. The men would fight, and the women would raise babies, and that's what existence without language would be like. Like, the men would just fight. Instead, men enter into having to give account for themselves and negotiate instead of fight, right? Women can also enter into this. In some sort of sense, they don't have to. A woman could go her whole life without fighting and without having an orgasm. Men do not have an option here. Men are going to fight, and they're going to have orgasms. Or they're going to learn to master their drives, to come into some other relation with themselves. And they're also going to have to go into language, and they have to develop recollection and reflection, right? There's interesting things here that have to be developed, probably by other people, not me. But there's a lot going on here with energy, and I think I just kind of want to tie it up with the idea that the cool, calm, and collected kind of energy that comes from Skole,
It can exist for someone who does not have a woman welcoming him home. It can even work for a woman who is asexual and has no sort of desire for any lover, and she just is very happy doing her thing, being a girl boss. This femininity, though, gets its strength as a metaphor from the fact that if you are alive, you were born of a woman, and that you either wish that you had her love or you are lucky enough to have had it. And if you are lucky enough to have had it, you had nurture. And if you were neglected, it is exactly nurture that you lacked. And it's not something that needs reason. It's not something that needs rationality. It's just something that comes from the heart. And I want to close this out with a shout out to Suzanne, who in my childhood was a kind of second mom to me. She was just a friend, a neighbor. I met her at a very pivotal point in my life, and she was just the most unconditionally loving person I ever met. And, I still go visit her I try to visit her every time I go up north. And she's not an online person. She's completely inaccessible to the world. She's one of the best mothers anyone could ever have. She and her daughter, who I babysat when I was a teenager, came to my wedding, mine and Anne's wedding. And, her daughter talked about like great memories of me babysitting her and all this stuff. But Suzanne, this sort of second mother figure, when she hears me, I don't normally talk about philosophy when I'm around her, right? We usually just joke. We joke around. Sometimes she'll get deep and share some emotional shit she's been going through or whatever. But for the most part, like we just kind of hang out, we post up and we just shoot the shit. I don't normally talk philosophical. I don't normally get into philosophy. She kind of knows I'm into all this bookish stuff. And she'll always maybe like every third visit that I've seen her over the last 10 years, like she'll say something like, "Oh, I know I'm dumb. I'm just a dumb person, but this is what I think." She feels that need to sort of clarify. But she says, I don't need to read. I don't need to be the smartest person to know that I can love more than anyone else, to know that I can nurture, to know that I can share my heart with other people, and that I can just live as a source of love and spread that into the world and make the world a better place. I don't know how to fix climate change. I don't know how to fix political polarization. I don't know how to do it, but I know how to hug people. I know how to listen to people. I know how to be there for people. And I would share a lecture like this with her because I think that she would find it meaningful, except that she's so put off by intellectual things. She's so put off by language itself. She really doesn't have any real faith in language. She doesn't have any faith in reason. My mom's very different. My mom's very, like, in a sort of sense, kind of masculine. Like, she's very logical. She's very combative. She's very domineering. She's like command and conquer. She's a drill sergeant. She's a grand master. She knows a million things. She's a farmer, right? Farmers know how to do everything. Well, Suzanne is, to me, like this sort of last bastion of pure nurture. And yes, it has a feminine connotation. And I don't know that that feminine connotation can ever be taken away from it without ruining everything, without taking the last little piece of what's human in us away from us. And I think that is that kind of unconditional love, that kind of welcoming hospitality, that sort of bringing in
of the other, welcome home, I've been waiting for you. It's important, and I think we're all suffering without it. And I think that femininity without it has been turned into a caricature of itself that is plastic. And it's because middle-class women who have been trying to play a certain game have said that it's all just a charade. Femininity is just a certain way of acting around men. I just don't think that that's true. I think that there is something there. I don't know what it is, but there's a there. And the only kind of queering of anything that I think has any sort of emancipatory or liberatory possibilities is one that preserves, nourishes, and spreads nurture outside of its own bounds, outside of its own interiority, and that shares that beyond these categories of man and woman. But if you lose nurture, there's only masculinity left, and it wins. And it doesn't matter if you dress it up like a woman or not. So the real question is not how you look or how you identify. The real question is are you in touch with the nurture inside of yourself? And everyone can be. We all have that capacity, but it's something that we have to foster the conditions for. And I feel like everyone, left to right, girl bosses to trad wives, are the products of broken homes and of institutions that have not just had this interest in instrumentalizing us by reducing our time energy to labor power, but that have primarily turned us all towards exploitation and shut us off towards nurture. Have fun reading it this week. Have fun reading it this week, guys. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I think you'll get a lot out of it. And I look forward to hearing all of your thoughts. And I'm glad we'll have a follow-up lecture with also a couple of discussions later this week. But that's all I've got for you now. Thank you. Thanks, guys. Really looking forward to hearing Anne's thoughts about this one because I know she'll be riffing off of it tomorrow at the seminar. Gonna go ahead and close this thing out right now because I actually have to go, but thank you guys, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts later. Take care. Subscribers get access to all past courses at Theory Underground, as well as ongoing courses taught by David McKerracher, Benjamin Studebaker, and Nina Power. Subscribers also get access to monthly research seminars, and the higher tiers of involvement unlock discussions and one-on-one small group tutelage. So if you're like me and you're never a huge bookish kind of person, but somewhere along the way you got really into listening to educational materials, if you got really into listening to podcasts and then books at work, if you love going deep into ideas, but you're just not a traditional bookish kind of person, well, this is where the alliance between people like us and people who are more bookish and specialized are able to meet to work through these things and do so in defense of the human, in defense of our dignity, in defense of our common humanity and our intellectual integrity. This is not a place where we're going to kick you out because you're pro-life or pro-choice, or where you are an atheist or a agnostic or a Christian. But it is a place where you're expected to love one another regardless of such things, and to show up for people in your actual IRL real life communities regardless of such things. And if that is exciting for you, and if you're excited to learn about what this approach, this method, this school of thought has to offer,
then I'm excited to meet you. Subscribe today.